Right now, one of the issues that's come up earlier in our conversation is that of capitalization. It definitely has to do with money. Oh, by the way, just to quickly mention the fact that we we reached out to the discos to also join in this conversation so we can also understand their perspective, but we weren't able to achieve that because none was willing to step out. So back to the issue of money is the fact that now many people are concerned about the debt profile of this country as at this moment. According to the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Nigeria's debt profile grew from 12.6 trillion naira in 2015 to 25.7 trillion naira in 2019 second quarter, an increase of 104%. And not only the LCCI that is concerned, many people in the organized private sector, many organizations in the organized private sector are expressing their concern. This is something many people are looking at. One other organization even said that Nigeria's debt servicing profile might increase to 3 trillion naira should the National Assembly approve and the federal government does secure another loan of about $30 billion. Joining us to have a conversation on this matter from our Kano studio is Professor Garba Sheka, Professor of Economics, Bayero University, as well as Ogbonna Okuku, Investment Promotion Expert in our Abuja studio. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. So let me start with you again, Professor Garba Sheka. What's your take on all of this? How challenged are we about these concerns being raised about Nigeria's rising debt profile?
I think, to me, I can see it's in dilemma in the sense that everybody is now growth rate. Everybody is concerned about economic growth of the country. And we know economy cannot grow without investment, even though theoretically there are certain schools that believe with the given level of investment, technical progress can also do the magic. But however, critical in every economy to grow is that there should be investment. And unfortunately, this investment is not only investment in consumer goods, but investment in critical infrastructure, just like the federal government mentioned. There must be investment in energy for industries to actually grow, and there must be investment in the transport infrastructure for movement of commodities and raw materials.
Okay. And, well, Professor, we'll get back to you to quickly take the opening comments of Mr. Ogbonna Okuku, an investment promotion expert in our Abuja studio. Well, Mr. Ogbonna Okuku, according to reports that we hear from different people, the debt servicing provision in the 2019 budget is put at a whopping 2 trillion naira from a budget of 2.9 trillion naira. Are we in a debt crisis?
No, we're not. It always sounds that way because it would be nice for each and every one of us to actually see this, look at this issue from the lender's point of view. The truth about the matter is no lender will give you money if you don't have the capacity to repay. Now again, you need to also look at who are these lenders. Federal government have made it clear that what they are going for will be concessionary loans. These are loans that have more generous conditions, better than what the global financial market is offering. Now, for example, you're going to have probably grace periods, you're going to have low interest rate and all of that. Now, we will be in a debt crisis if we don't have the capacity. And then again, don't forget that the institutions that give these loans are non-governmental or multilateral agencies that their procedures to approval of loans are so stringent and well detailed. So if they have looked at our society or our economy and they feel that it's not a good place to put in their money, they won't. So, I mean, everybody might be shouting, yes, the debt profile is rising. The real issue here is how do we realize funds as a country to begin to service critical infrastructure that have been begging for support, that have been begging for investment. So the only way out, as we speak now, yes, you have, you must have your long-term plans, you must have your short-term plans, but in the interim, well, you need to move. If you remember correctly, in the last National Assembly, this same issue came up when the president presented, to the National Assembly that he needed approval for $30 billion loan to fund critical infrastructure. And then it was actually turned down by that National Assembly. The politics around it is not what I would like to discuss, but the truth is, if we must get out of where we are as a country, those investments must happen. And then again, don't forget, it's not as if you're borrowing money for consumption. You're borrowing money for critical infrastructure. And then these monies are tied to projects being supported by organizations like the China Exim, the German Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, African Development Bank. And these people, if they have not looked at critically on this, into this project and see that these are projects that are worth putting those monies in, they will not do that. So I don't think we're in any debt crisis, but we just need to up our game when it comes to revenue generation. And because we have the potentials, that is why those lenders will want to put money here.
Usually when the talk about borrowing comes up, there's this argument that is usually put in place, which is that, you know what, Nigeria is not the only country in debt. If you look at the United States, the country has a total debt of about $23 trillion. So it's not a big deal to borrow. But then don't let's forget that this is not the first time we are borrowing as a nation. You recall the Paris Club refund and how we said, you know what, we're not going to get into the situation again. But the big talk about this is the fact that we have borrowed. But then looking at what we have on ground, prior to the 1999 election and then the 2005, 2006, we didn't have a lot to show for it. So the question is, what is different now with this borrowing? How can we say, yes, we're borrowing, but we'll ensure that we get the best out of this borrowing? So that's the big question. What is different now?
Yeah, the difference is this particular borrowing they're all tied to projects, certain critical projects that will support the emancipation or the growth of our economy. Look at the railways, the road infrastructure, power, which is one issue that everybody keeps talking about. You don't have enough transmission. The transmission corridors that you have won't be able to support whatever generation that you want the private sector to come and generate and all of that. You're looking at education, which is a critical part of growing your economy. Because if you take all the issues, healthcare, so this particular borrowing is going straight to transactions that, of course, the lenders also will be part of the procurement process. They'll be part of implementation process. So you can't compare this particular borrowing with what used to happen in the past before 1999 that we go into the debt crisis that we went into as a country. This is a different ballgame. And I believe that the economic managers, they know that we can't find ourselves in the debt crisis as a country at this point in time, with the whole world looking at us, knowing that we have a lot of potentials. We have to up our game, like I said earlier, when it comes to revenue generation. The opportunities are there for us to show up our revenue as a country, but as it stands now, we can't just sit back and wait until we're able to show up our revenue. We have to continue, building the necessary infrastructure that we need to also even attract investment into the country.
You know what? You have said that this is perhaps the right step in the right direction, even though a lot of other people don't agree with you. But then, if we're going to do this, we need to also ensure that the monies are spent the right way. And that's the big question now on the mind of a lot of Nigerians, saying, if we're borrowing, how do we ensure that we use these funds the right way? So if you could enumerate some checks and balances we need to put in place such that we don't squander these funds, what will they be for you?
For me, it's a very simple thing, because the organizations or the institutions that you're borrowing from, like I said, they all have regimented system You can't take money from German Development Bank and then you take the money and then you go and dump it somewhere. No, they have their project coordinators here who will be assigned to this project. They have their consultants who will be giving them daily report, project managers that will be giving them daily reports on this project. Are we talking about the Exim loan for the railways? Of course, they are not going to just dump those monies here. These are projects strictly tied to funding tied to projects. So it will be difficult to mismanage this fund. And I can also tell you that with the present, the clamor for, for the fight against corruption in Nigeria today, it will be difficult for anyone to divert any fund that is being borrowed or any money is being generated in this country at this point in time.
Capacity is an issue, Mr. Okuku. So, yes, Nigeria, has all of the investments, a very big economy, and not, capable of being able to absorb this thing. At some point, the federal government said, we don't want to get any loans anymore. We don't want this nation to be in debt. And then at some other point, the federal government also says, hey, let's borrow some more money for this critical infrastructure that you have talked about. So the challenge a number of people are raising is the fact that the debt servicing profile is very, very high. Doesn't that give you concern?
See, the debt servicing profile getting higher is actually attributed to, because when you borrow domestic and an external borrowing, it's usually cheaper when you borrow outside. Now, sometimes you have to also borrow out, externally because of the interest rate, which is usually lower, to service maturing loans that are within the system. So if you look at it, if you index it properly, you will see that the profile that is going high is based on the fact that we have been borrowing internally, and then the interest rate is usually higher. Now, if you're going for concessionary loans, like I said earlier, these loans come with probably 5 years grace period most of the time. You're not even talking about interest or even repaying the principal until after 5 years. Now, if you have that kind of moratorium, it gives you that laxity, the liberty to actually replan and then reorganize yourself when it comes to repayment of these loans. So having said that,
one moment. The concern here is not the rightness or not of the loans that we're getting. It's the fact that according to the LCCI, 70% of Nigeria's national budget for 2019 was spent on debt servicing. That's the question. Doesn't that give you concern? Because it's definitely giving some people concern.
I'll be optimistic here. Why will I be optimistic? Because if peradventure you shore up your revenue base, if you increase your revenue base, it will not show. Rather, you have more money to service those debts that have accrued over the years. Yes, I understand where they are all coming from. But if you have potentials and then you're working towards their policies, policy direction towards, increasing your revenue as a country, it becomes easier for you to, yes, pay off your debt and then at the same time still do, the things that, other obligations that you need funds for.
Go back to the 8th Assembly. This is before the 9th Assembly, and we're waiting to see what the 9th Assembly will do about it. But you recall, during the 8th Assembly, the President also presented this proposal to the 8th Assembly, and it was, most of it was rejected. And according to the statement which was put out, there were only a few parts of that documentation or that proposal that was accepted by the 8th Assembly. And they had their reasons for doing that. So now that this is before the 9th Assembly, what do you think should be done about it? Do you think they should say, you know what, let's look at these areas. We don't perhaps need to borrow this much. Let's pick some key, areas and borrow it. Or do you think they should go all out and say, approved, let's borrow everything?
I think the 9th Assembly should sit with the finance minister and then they look at some of these line items that you want to borrow for, and then see how critical they are, how important they are. Then by the time you do your critical mass, the analysis of how important these projects are, then you can now decide whether to approve or not approve. But I still think, see, we'll come back to square one. If we don't see reasons why we should take these concessionary loans being offered by, multilateral agencies that on a normal day, they would have also done their analysis to see that these projects that we're embarking on, they are critical projects. They are projects that will help the economy. They are projects that will also support your ability to attract, foreign investment, to attract even local investment into your economy. You were talking about power sector earlier. See, there's nowhere on earth you will have people put their money in generating power in a country where you don't have enough transmission corridor to evacuate whatever power I'm going to be generating. So you see, it's a chicken and egg thing. So there has to be a time when you will take that decision and say, okay, let me move forward. Yes, the profile is getting higher, but that does not mean that you don't have the capacity to repay. Now, another thing I think the Ninth Assembly should be looking at is how do we now begin to increase revenue? What are the things we need to do as a country so that we can get more income? As it stands now, oil cannot, gas cannot solve our problem. What are the things impeding investment in the solid mineral sector? What are the things that we need to do so that we can have a backward integration in our in manufacturing sector, in agriculture? So those are the things we have to now sit down, have a sit down, and then have this conversation, and then the solutions will now begin to come. Although there are other areas where monies can come from, but those are things that will be put on the table, and then we'll see how fast we can get these things done. But whether those infrastructures we need to, whether it is those infrastructure we are looking at are important, yes, they are. Will they help the economy? Yes, they will help the economy. Do we need them now? Yes, we do. So what are the things we need to do? What are the things we have to do going forward? Those are the things that we need to sit down and discuss quickly.
Okay, let's go to Abuja now and speak with Professor Garba, or rather Kano. Let's leave Abuja for Kano and go to Professor Garba Sheka and find out what his views are about borrowing in general. We're glad to have you back. So what are your views seeing this proposal by the federal government to borrow? What do you think about it?
Well, actually, my views about borrowing is that, well, it became, to me, it is inevitable. We just have to borrow. And theoretically, there is nothing bad in taking loan because it only depends on what you put the money into. And like I started saying earlier, the Nigerian government is in dilemma. Nigerians are looking forward to hear about GDP growth. And unfortunately, GDP growth cannot come without investment, and Nigerian government is facing a very low level of income. Revenue is low, oil revenue is not certain, and so on and so forth. And then a political government wants to make impact in just 4 years. So really, to loan became inevitable, especially when we see the budget. Since the administration of Jonathan to date, our budget have been, a bit, we can say one-sided. Recurrent expenditure is heavier than capital expenditure. And then that aside, since this administration came, right from 2015 to date, the budget have been a deficit one. And certainly this year, there's a deficit of 2.18 trillion. And certainly every economist knows that a deficit budget ends up with actually borrowing. So there's nothing wrong in borrowing if the money we put in critical infrastructure, like the federal government said. They identified 39 critical infrastructure to invest the loan in. I think if that is what actually happened, there is nothing. There's no problem in that. I support that government should go for the loan because that is the only option now. Anybody that said they should not take the loan may not be able to profile any viable solution with regards to the revenue required to actually finance investment in the critical infrastructure. And you see, the problem is that the main policy thrust of the government is diversification, which means the industrial sector as well as the agri sector should be actually revitalized. And all of these require some infrastructure. Like there is no way you can develop the industrial sector without providing energy. And investment in the power sector have been very huge since Obasanjo's period. And if we really want to make impact, you really have to put a lot of money so that there can be steady power supply. And again, Take an example of an investor here in Kano, whose raw material come from abroad, who will have to come, it will have to come through Tinkan or Apapa. He has to transport the raw material down to the factory in Kano, and if he wants to enjoy the large market in Lagos, he also has to transport the finished product back to Lagos. At the end of the day, cost of production will be high. If you compare the cost of production or the prices of the commodities produced in the country, will now, it's now going to be higher than those brought from abroad. So certainly, we may not have the capacity to actually compete effectively with commodities that came from foreign countries. And as such, if we really want to diversify, it doesn't mean, it's not just enough to diversify for the sake of being self-sufficient. We also have to be able to export and be competitive in our prices. And so without critical infrastructure like the railway and a very modest transportation infrastructure provided, certainly cost of production will be very high for the manufacturers in Nigeria. And so our prices cannot be competitive and we cannot have a place in the world market.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Shikabe. Let's take this back to Mr. Okuku. Both of you, gentlemen, have talked about the importance of raising revenue through, whatever means that government can do. And you remember, Mr. Okuku, that Professor Shekar talked about the imbalance of the capital and recurrent expenditures of governments. What do we need to do, or what can we do now to shore up the capital expenditure by getting in more money from wherever? One of the concerns that definitely is that of the private sector is that this money that is going to be gotten, the revenue that is going to be raised by the government, will most certainly come from taxes. Much of it is going to come from taxes, which is why they've been kicking, raising concerns about the finance bill that's in the National Assembly at this moment. So don't you think that the private sector is justified in kicking, noting that the likelihood of the weight of getting this money back for government to be able to service the debts would be their own responsibility at the end of the day?
Yeah, generally speaking, when it comes to revenue generation, it affects everybody, because whether we like it or not, see, our tax to GDP is still about 6%, which is one of the lowest in the world. Or countries that want to develop, you have to have more people in your tax net. You need to come up with policies and programs that will make people pay taxes. Now, again, we need to also, we have to also, the proposal to increase the VAT is also, for me, because we have limited, ways of getting monies when it comes to revenues and, generating funds. Now, if you increase your VAT, yes, it will have some effect on the economy, but at the end of the day, service provided must be, added values and service provided must be paid for. If you don't want service addition, it really can't function. So value addition requires, you have to actually pay for it. Then again, of course, there are other innovative, innovative ways to get monies. But the basic one will be your tax regime. So we have to get it right first when it comes to tax regime. Then we'll now begin to look at other areas, like seeing if we're looking for long-term funds, how we can actually get funds out of the pension scheme. I use this pension scheme as an example because it is an area where we need to look critically at. Then again, let me say this. It's going to be a process. It will take a while to unbundle whatever laws and regulations surrounding the pension funds. Now, you need to borrow so that you can be running before you can get all those changes, before the changes can happen. So when it comes to pension funds, you have to be creative, because you can't just allow pension fund managers just invest monies in, according to them, low risk investments. Now, I say this because first things first, there has to be an indexing, a categorization of pension contributors, which which speaks to the fact that if somebody gets employed today, he or she might not need the pension fund in the next 20, 25 years. So you can actually use the Chilean model where you can discuss with the owners of these funds and say, okay, we have opened up this space. We can invest in higher risk investment, higher, which brings higher revenue. But it is your choice, the owner of the funds, to actually decide to say, okay, my pension fund manager, you can use that fund and then to invest in higher risk investments. Now, with that,
Well,
we're talking about
Mr.
over
Okuko,
6
just one
trillion naira
moment.
here.
It's a concluding moment, but let's take this to Professor Garba Shika in our Kano studio. Very quick one. How do you allay the fears or concerns of the private sector who feel very strongly that the capital expenditure, recurrent expenditure imbalance is too high and risky for the economy?
Well, actually, the fact that the recurrent expenditure is so high, in fact, in the 2020 budget, more than twice than the capital expenditure is so critical and is something that people will be afraid of. Sincerely speaking, that is the reason why most of us are thinking that this loan that government wants to take is going to be used in financing recurrent expenditure because it is going to be an integral component of the budget since it is a deficit budget. And so if government has to receive loan for this budget to succeed, it means that portion of the recurrent expenditure, which is very huge, is also going to succeed. So certainly in every country that is running a very normal budget, capital expenditure is supposed to be higher than recurrent expenditure. And I think, again, that is one of the reasons why we are now resorting to loans, because the loans are going to be used in financing infrastructure. If the capital expenditure has been higher than the recurrent expenditure for all this period, certainly we may not even need to take the loan. So, sincerely speaking, whether we like it or not, we'll reach a point where it will become necessary for us to reduce, especially the cost of governance, which is a major component of our recurrent expenditure. And by this, I may take a leave from the Okorocha's proposal that they should reduce the size of the National Assembly, probably one senator from each state and probably 2 or 3 members of rep from each state to reduce the cost of governance, because that is critical. That is what makes our recurrent expenditure to be very high. Our democracy is very expensive. Look at the cost of conducting elections. Whenever election is to be conducted, no matter how small, they will start calling billions. Sincerely speaking, we have to address all this. Otherwise, we'll continue to be getting ourselves deep into this crisis. Certainly, there is any cause for the private sector to be afraid, because critical infrastructure that will support them, like energy, like road, like any other infrastructure, especially in the agricultural sector, where we also need to diversify the economy through that sector. Critical
So
infrastructure
thank
like
you. I'm sorry, we are completely out of time, but we want to thank you very, very much for being a part of our conversation this morning. Professor Garba Sheka is Professor of Economics at Barrow University, and he spoke to us from our Kano studio, as well as Mr. Ogbonna Okuku, who is an investment promotion expert who joined our conversation from Abuja, our Abuja studio. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being a part of this conversation. Well, just before we go, a few messages that's been sent in. We'll begin with this one by Victor Owo, who says, why don't the discos charge us consumers according to hours of energy supplied instead of a flat 24-hour by 30 days monthly billing cycle? The regulators are helping discos to frustrate consumers.
All right, let's skip to this fourth one from Conscience at Watch 1981. Says, increase in energy tariff is not logical when the discussants just opined that money generated by discos were embezzled by them and not properly accounted for. How come you propose increase in tariff without tackling accountability problems?
Well, that's a question that someone has to answer, but Victor Owo again says, over the years, they've been giving us estimated bills, and the power we consume is not commensurate to what they bring. And I took it on myself to pay part of every bill. So I've had a heavy backlog. So they said, I must clear that outstanding balance first before I get prepaid Okay, very, very interesting. Anyway, those are some of your comments. You can go to our Twitter handle and, of course, follow the thread on our YouTube channel and other platforms to join in the conversation. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Ayo Makinde.
And I'm Kayode Okikelu. Have a beautiful day.